What did the American people adopt in 1791? But rather we're trying to figure out, what does natural law require? Well, then of course we ought to look to what intelligent judges in other countries who think they're doing the same job, and by the way, they do think they're doing the same job. I mean, around the world there seems to be a notion that that's what judges do. When you put on a black robe, you become somehow an expert on morality and natural law, even though I never learned much of either one at Harvard Law School. I don't know. If you take that position, of course. If you take my position, it's obvious that what a French court or a Ugandan court thinks today should be the law has nothing whatever to do with what the American people voted for when they ratified the Constitution or ratified the Bill of Rights.
The Constitution in its text refers explicitly to the law of nations, the term then for international law being part of the law of this country.
It was a reference to public international law, not the rights of individuals, but the rights of states against states. That's what the law of nations meant at the time.
Well, you're a great fan, supporter of referring to history to try to give meaning to some of the broad clauses in the Constitution. I see that as completely analogous to looking at what we can learn, not as binding, but as informative and persuasive when we see how other judges have struggled with similar language in their own constitutions.
But they're not struggling with similar language adopted by similar people. It may well be that when the French adopted such language, or when the Germans adopted it after World War II, they meant something quite different from what the American people meant. Even if we had adopted it at the same time, we might have meant different things, because we are not France and we are not Germany. But when you go back and say, well, we made those decisions in 1791, it's just totally irrelevant what current courts of foreign countries think. Unless you think judges are to be moral arbiters of the world, which you don't want us to be that.
I don't think judges.
I don't want to be that. That's it sounds like fun, but.
This is a corollary question, perhaps. It asks you, Justice Scalia, are you truly surprised that other developed nations recoil at the use of the death penalty in the U.S.?
What nations are you talking about? Public opinion polls in both England and France, at least until very recently, showed that if they had as responsive a democracy as we do, they would still have the death penalty. The death penalty was prohibited in the German Constitution, largely because they were worried that ex-Nazis would receive the death penalty. And that was introduced at the pressure from the German right. I find it so hypocritical. Not that the Europeans don't have the death penalty, fine, if they don't, although its abolition was imposed by the Court of Human Rights, which said you cannot have the death penalty. So it's not as though all the Europeans voted to abolish it. It was judicially imposed, and that doesn't impress me very much.
The Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishments, I think is another great example of what we can infer was a deliberately open-ended clause. The framers could have specified particular punishments that were unconstitutional. Instead, they chose this open-textured language, and as the Supreme Court said many years ago, earlier in the 20th century, that calls on its face for interpretation in light of evolving standards of decency in civilized society, expressly referring not only to America, but other civilized societies.
To believe that about the Eighth Amendment as well as about the rest of the Bill of Rights, you have to believe this, that what the framers of the Bill of Rights said was, we think certain things are cruel and unusual. Thumbscrews, for example. We don't like thumbscrews. But we want to adopt this clause for the future. If you think thumbscrews are okay, that's fine. This provision is meant to evolve. All the Eighth Amendment really means is, to thine own self be true. Don't do anything that you think is cruel and unusual. That's not what they meant. They meant to establish a standard. They were worried the whole purpose of the entire Bill of Rights was to guard against future generations that they feared might not be as virtuous or as wise as they were. They were not Pollyannish people. And if you think that the evolution always, every day in every way, we get better and better. We don't always get better and better. Sometimes we get worse, and the purpose of the Bill of Rights was to prevent that.
I agree. It's an ultimate safety net. Certainly we can't retrench to the 18th century, but hopefully we are evolving toward more and more freedom and equality for more people. And that is exactly what the trajectory of this country has been. When you think of where we started,
where is that one-way street, Nadine? Where does it say the only way the Constitution, the Bill of Rights can evolve is in the direction of more freedom? It doesn't say that anywhere.
Yeah,
and you will find that it has evolved in both directions.
Due process of law, equal protection of laws is not a ratification for cutting back on fundamental rights or cutting back on equality.
If it is to mean whatever the current society wants it to mean, sometimes it'll give you more liberties, sometimes it will take away liberties. Another area where I'm sure I came out the way your members would like was with respect to the Confrontation Clause of the Bill of Rights, which a Supreme Court that believed in an evolving Constitution had essentially gutted. The Confrontation Clause guarantees to all criminal defendants the right to be confronted with the witnesses against them, which means the witness has to appear in open court and make his accusation in open court and be cross-examined. The court had said all that really means is that any hearsay evidence, that is evidence that isn't personally brought before the court, but somebody comes in and says, oh, he told me so. Any hearsay evidence must bear indicia of reliability. Well, that's not what the Confrontation Clause said. And I'm happy to say, two terms ago, we went back to the original meaning, which had been gutted 20 years earlier. We overruled that earlier case and said, no, the Confrontation Clause means what it says. You have the right to be confronted with the witnesses against you. So there, but my point is, if you fall in love with an evolving Constitution, do not think that it's going to evolve in just one direction. It's going to evolve in both directions.
Well, certainly the Supreme Court has made mistakes, dare I say, throughout history. But the concept is one of morphing in favor of the general principles of equal justice under law. When we go back to the founding of this country, to the Declaration of Independence, to the original Constitution and Bill of Rights, we had those aspirations, but we were so far from achieving them in reality. Need I mention the groups that were completely excluded from actual protection? Racial minorities and women and all kinds of sexual orientation minorities, ethnic minorities. We have seen a history where sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, sometimes it's the other way, but the general pattern has been one of more and more freedom for more and more individuals and groups in this society. And what I found so thrilling about the language in Justice Kennedy's opinion, and I don't think of Justice Kennedy as a radical civil libertarian. I doubt that he's a member of the ACLU. I haven't checked our files. And that was the case, of course, that extended equal rights to sexual orientation minorities, lesbian and gay men. And he ended